the drivers of pertinent land use and land cover change in the tropics, evaluating the management strategies for tropical forest agricultural landscapes, and understanding the effects of environmental changes on food security. So, the title for today's talk is a Land System Science Perspective on Southeast Asia's Haze. So, let's welcome Prof Janice.
Turning up and also for being here. Thanks Shivan for inviting me to be at this IAS graduate STEM colloquium. For all my colleagues who are also here, I also invite you guys to hear more on the STEM graduate colloquium. So basically, initially my talk was about land cover change processes in Sumatra, but because we just experienced the Haze, I thought it would be very topical to also talk about the Southeast Asian Haze. So my talk today is about using a land system science perspective to this issue. It's pretty informal, and I'll be talking some of my research projects, but also highlighting the research from other very important scholars. And I will also be talking about some projects that we have not done, so I can only tell you what we plan to do, but not really any results yet. Alright, so I would like to begin with two international reports on land and why land systems are increasingly interesting, or increasingly a lot of attention is being paid to studying the processes of land use change. So one is the IPBS report. This came out in May this year, and it talked about how biodiversity is being threatened because there's a lot of ecosystems that are being affected by human activities. So one very clear example is how the Amazon or Cerrado in South America is being affected by cattle ranching, and you know of the Brazilian fires right now. So that is very much a driver of land use change, agriculture, and also livestock production of important ecosystem services, and also threaten ecosystems. So in this report, it talks about how 47% of ecosystems in general have declined from a state of natural or estimated extent to present time. So this was like the international global assessment on biodiversity ecosystem services, and a lot of attention is being paid to land use, land management, and how that can affect biodiversity and ecosystem services. And then the second report that came out that also highlighted the issue of land is from the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Just a word, the IPBS is something like the IPCC for biodiversity and ecosystem services. Right, so this IPCC report came out in September, and also the attention is about how land use change contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. So about 24% of GHG emissions come from agriculture, forestry, and other land use. So it also plays, or other places, the spotlight of land use, how that pertains to climate change and how we should manage our land uses. So, when we talk about land use, there's a lot of questions that come up, like how do we actually study land use and systems? Actually, all of us have been studying it from very separate disciplines. So you could be studying the response of biodiversity if you're a biologist to different land use change. You could be studying the processes of, or rather the human and also environmental relationships through an anthropologist perspective, like the cultural values that the ecosystem has to you. You could be studying it from a geologist perspective, understanding more about the history of Earth's surface. So we have been studying land use, the terrestrial land cover of the Earth from very different disciplines. But land system science is about trying to integrate all these different disciplines and understanding more about the drivers, the processes, mechanisms of land use change, and how that also affects the people and also the environment. So today's talk, I'll just introduce a little bit more about what land system science is about, the perennial problem of the Southeast Asian Haze. So this is like the question I always get from journalists, why is it such a perennial problem? And then what we are doing to study the haze. So I'll introduce a project that we just got funding for, and that's more related to restoring the habitat for the haze. And then what can be done, what more should be done. So if there's any questions, just keep that in mind. We can discuss more at the end of the talk. Alright, so brief introduction. So land systems, they constitute the terrestrial component of the Earth system. It really encompasses everything. It's a very broad sort of definition, encompasses the processes, activities related to human land use, all aspects of society, social, economic, technological aspects. And then we also try to understand more about the consequences. So what are the benefits, what are the problems related to land use change? So the disciplines sort of evolved from traditional studies on land use and land climate change, looking at monitoring and modeling what are the impacts of, say for example, deforestation, desertification. Then it has become more integrative. So it includes like drivers and impacts of land change. And then when we talk about drivers and impacts, a lot of the drivers are actually human-based kind of drivers. So deforestation, mostly related to people who are coming in and then clearing the forest. But who are these people and what skills do they operate? So these are the kinds of questions that we pose. We engage scientists across social, economic, geographical, and natural sciences. So within my team, we hired an anthropologist this year, and then we work across discipline boundaries to be able to build on the strengths and also have different disciplines contribute their techniques, their methods to understanding more about the land use change process. We also look more into the interactions between the social and ecological systems, maybe focusing more on feedbacks and how people adapt to changes when, say for example, if you deforest an area, how does that affect your environmental condition? Then how do you actually change your behavior in order to reduce deforestation, for example? And then a very sort of like trending topic is the issue of data collection. So because we're all globalized, right? The world is very connected. So whatever that's happening in one part of the world, for example, the changes in diets in Europe, how does that affect the deforestation in the Amazon? How does that affect the heatland or the Haze issue that we experience in Southeast Asia? So these group of land system scientists, they probably originated from I can't use this thing. So we used to be called this IGPP program, so the Interaction for Geosphere and Biosphere. Then it sort of moved into Future Earth program and also the Global Land program. So if you go to these websites, you know more about the community, like the scientists who are involved in these organizations. They're very diverse, they come from very different disciplines, but their interest is trying to answer the issue of land use change from very diverse perspectives. Alright, so land system changes are a result of human decision making at different scales, as I mentioned. So you could look at deforestation as a process that's occurring at the local scale, whereby you have the farmers needing to plant oil palm and then they cut down the forest. But it could also be related to national plan, for example, Indonesia wanting to ramp up palm oil production, and then having a standard whereby they try to increase the productivity of oil palm plantations. And maybe they also grant access to companies to expand over these lands. Or it could also be related to international levels or series of arrangements or trade agreements. So for example, if, as I mentioned, like the demand for palm oil is high in some of these countries, that can lead to more palm oil being imported, more trade agreements from European countries to Indonesia, trying to import more of this palm oil from Indonesia. So that has an effect at the local scale as well. Right, so I've always been working on this issue of palm oil expansion and how does that lead to deforestation, and also what causes deforestation, what's the best way to clear the forest is also by using fires. Right, so when we look at this as a whole, right, if we have this land use change process, right, you will be gaining certain benefits from the land, but yet at the same time you might also have some detrimental effects as well. So when we use the land, we will be able to also modify what kind of services are being provided by the ecosystem. So that basically brings about interactions between the ecosystem and also the social processes. And so you can you can't run away from studying both systems. You have to understand more about the social system and also the ecological system and try to link them together. So land system change basically is a cause and also a consequence of these socio-ecological processes that I talked about. operating at different scales. And telecoupling is also a very trendy topic these days. So it's about connecting the teleconnections that are happening in very disparate places. So one example would be how power production in Indonesia has been affected by soybean oil production in Brazil, and they are linked together because of the global vegetable oil market. I will talk a little bit more about that if you don't really know what this means. So this process of telecoupling is really just trying to link very distal coupled human network systems, and also trying to understand what's happening in place A, how is it affecting place B. So there are many theories that also coming up with regards to telecoupled systems. It's a very new field. It's something that's still being defined, and but it's something that I think is of growing importance as we see how the world is so connected through trade networks, and also information flows from one place to another. Right, so there's a lot of opportunity to study land system science in Asia. Infrastructure development, say for example, China's investment in the Belt and Road Initiative is causing a lot of dams and also roads to be built. Right, so how is China's policies affecting Africa? How are they affecting Asia? You have the issue of urbanization, resource extraction like mining, and also agriculture, which is something that is close to my heart. So the focus really is to understand these processes and mechanisms and also the consequences. Right, so how we do it really is to use remote sensing or geospatial analysis. So satellite imagery gives you a lot of information about what's happening on the ground, but you still need to go to the ground to understand whether what you're seeing from satellite imagery is real or it might be an error. So there needs to be field work that's conducted if you want to get more environmental or social data. And then often we try to combine these, the knowledge that we produce from these two different fields to inform how we want to model the system and understand more about land use change in the future. So I studied oil palm expansion in Southeast Asia, right? So palm oil is a very common vegetable oil product. In fact, I think it's the largest vegetable oil. It has already overtaken soybean oil. So if you use, today probably you already use any kind of probably you already touch one product that has palm oil, either in your cosmetics or in your shampoo or in your toothpaste, or you've eaten some processed food which is likely to have palm oil as well. And recently there has been a push as well for biodiesel, so changing or deriving your energy source from plant-based biomass. So if you haven't seen the oil palm tree, this is what it looks like. And these are the fresh fruit bunches that come from the oil palm tree. So if you drive from Singapore to Malaysia, it's likely you come across lots of plantations. Right, so Malaysia and Indonesia export more than 80% to the world, right? So in some ways, if we were to just ban palm oil, what's going to happen to, all these industries? What's going to happen to the people who are also working in these industries? So sometimes, when people promote these rather simplistic solutions, like let's just ban palm oil, no palm oil coming out from Indonesia and Malaysia, it just kind of covers a lot of the complexities that are involved in this issue. So for my PhD, I actually work a lot on oil palm, but more focus on the smallholder sector. So we looked into the land cover change in some of these sectorial boundaries owned by smallholders, state companies, and also private enterprises. And we quantified what is the key soil forest loss as well as lowland forest loss that's coming from these three different sectorial boundaries. We went down to the ground and then we talked to the stakeholders who are living in Sumatra. So this is the oil palm smallholder living in Riau, and understand more about his yields and what are the factors that are affecting his yields and income. We also had to talk to people from companies. So companies play a very big role in operating in these landscapes. So talking to them, understanding more about what are their practices, why do they choose to set up their operations here, what are the challenges that they're also facing them in terms of their interactions with smallholders. And then to use this information to understand more about how you can model industrial pathways of oil palm expansion or smallholder pathways of oil palm expansion. So if you look on oil palm, for sure you will have to also touch the topic of peatlands because this is a study produced by Prof so he was my previous PhD advisor. And then he looked at remotely sensed products of peatland extent and also closed canopy oil palm. So closed canopy oil palm means that they are pretty mature, more than 8 years, and the land size is more than 2 square km. Right? So this is a rather rough understanding of where oil palm is being planted. Also, it's using 250 meters Modis imagery, but it gives you a sense of where are the oil palm plantations in. This is what we call Switzerland, Peninsular Malaysia, Sumatra, Kalimantan, and Kalimantan, Sarawak, and also Sabah. And how much of closed canopy oil palm is there in this region? Because this is really the place where oil palm is being planted. So you have about 8.3 million hectares of closed canopy oil palm. About 10% of this is planted on peatlands. So a more recent study that used 30-meter satellite imagery looked into what exactly is also driving the land use change of peatlands. So this is a more up-to-date kind of a study, and they looked into not just oil palm, but industrial oil palm, industrial acacia plantations. So these are your hotwood plantations, smallholder agriculture, but there's no differentiation about whether it's oil palm or not. And then basically they sort of pointed the finger not so much on the industrial actors, but on the smallholders, who accounted for 43% of all agricultural conversion of peatland observed by 2010. Right, but it's followed up quite closely by the oil palm plantations, about 39%. So, the role that these actors play in these landscapes in causing land use change and then their use of fires and how does that affect the case, it's all one very big web of interconnections and relationships. Alright, so now I move into the perennial problem of the Southeast Asian haze. Often when I get media interviews, this is a question that always comes up. I experienced the haze in 97, 98. Why am I still experiencing it in 2019? Right. So this is an image of the 2015 fires from NASA. You can see the smoke plumes coming out from the peatlands, right? So the fires are really massive. They're burning at very high temperatures, very intense fires occurring. And the smog that's covering these areas is just incredible. Right? You can really visualize it from satellite imagery. Right, so this is data coming from Global Fires database. So these are all remotely sensed products. On the y-axis, you have the cumulative extent or accumulated active fire detections for the monthly or for each month, right? And then your lines represent the different years. Right? So the biggest fire event is 2015, based on data that you can get. Remotely sent products from 2003 to 2015. So this doesn't include 97, 98 because at the time technology was not that advanced. So we have up to about 122 active fire detections for the 2015 fires. A lot of people want to know what is the comparison with 2019. So this is a recent, I think this very recent, but it's not complete, right? It's a recent calculation of the accumulated fires for 2019, so this represented the rate. Right, so this is from Judah Vanderhoff. So he's like a much more accomplished fire scientist who's been looking into this for a long time. So you can see that the accumulated fire detections are not as great for the same year for 2019 compared to 2015. Also, the fire started a little bit later. Right, so the fires in 2015 began around July, but for 2019 it began right around end of July and early August. Right? So the fires are really massive during these times, mainly because of climatic conditions. So 2015, 2006, right, the other very big fire event, these are El Nino events, right? And then this year they say that it's related to El Nino, but also related to the Indian Ocean dipole. So there are there's a longer drought period because of the movement of the ocean currents in the Indian Ocean. Right, so we were in Jambi where the fires were also occurring. So this was August 2019 with a team from Institute Pertanian Bogor, which is the Bogor Agricultural University. And you can see like the water levels in a lot of the rivers, canals, they're really very low. And these are like remote areas where the fires are. So having access to water to try to put out the fires is also a very big challenge for the firefighters in these areas. Right, so this is an example of a burnt smallholder plot. Right, so this is pinang, so it's a kind of plant that they use for like betel-nut, chewing betel-nut, or some other products from betel-nut. This is how the peat fires are. So you can see that the fires are smoldering, right? So it's mainly because of slow combustion. So these are areas which are still moist, but yet at the same time they are on fire. So that produces a lot of smoke in these peatlands. And then over here you can see how when the peat burns, right, it also burns away the peat soil. So it also exposes the roots of a lot of crops in these areas, and then these plants will then topple over, right? And then this is in September 2019, so UT and I were there actually, and this is a sort of like active above ground biomass burning, right? So you can see the fire here, right? And this is actually on smallholder land. So the community is planting either some kind of tree crop, I think in this case pinang, but you can also see acacia plantations at the back. So what smallholders do, because they don't have so much equipment, they try to do a makeshift fire break. So this is something like a hose, and then they poke holes in it, and then the water is being pumped from a canal, and then they try to wet this area so that they prevent the fire to come over and burn away their smallholder. So the access to these areas are very tough, very challenging. Resources are also very low, and people really do struggle to try to put out the fire. So sometimes when Singaporeans complain, oh, why is Indonesia burning again? Why do we have the fires? If you go down to the ground, it really shows the big challenges that Indonesia faces with this problem. Right, so part of the reason why we came here is to check out revegetation sites, because that's what our project is about. So this road was supposed to lead us to the revegetation site that was started by WWF or TGI, which is a gas company. So it's part of the CSR project. But we couldn't even access because the fires were coming in this direction. Right? So the fires, they happened originally over here, and then the community members also mentioned how it has spread and traveled over to this direction. So this direction is actually company land. Right? So sometimes when we read reports and the companies say that the fires were initially out of our concession land, they're coming from other lands. It's not entirely that they're trying to greenwash or they're trying to tell lie. These things really do happen. The fire spread is very real, and it depends on which direction, depends on the soil moisture, right, how dry it is. Alright, so why is it that this is such a perennial problem? You have to think about it in terms of this historical perspective. What has happened over the last few decades, right, that has led to this problem being such a disaster, ecological disaster, humanitarian disaster. So in the 1970s, already you started doing a lot of logging on peat forests. So when you cut down the trees, that really caused a lot of desiccation of the soil, right? And also leads to more biomass on the ground, right? So you have debris, logging debris that's accumulated, and that could be fuel for fires in drought seasons. Then in the 80s and 2000s, we have the drainage of these peat farms. So that is mainly for agriculture and plantation agriculture. Right? So here you see industrial oil palm plantation. The age of the oil palm is roughly the same. It's very straight rows, rectangular blocks that you can see from satellite imagery. Here you see like smallholder or mosaic kind of oil palm that's been planted. Each structure is kind of different, very patchy kind of expansion as well. Right? And then here you see the canals being dug up for drainage. So from 2000s to now, it's really a mixed agency, companies and also smallholders. It's hard to have very clear understanding of who exactly is causing this deforestation and also the fires, because There's also a lot of unclear land tenure on the ground. When you go down to the ground, these maps might be overlapping with one another. So there's a lot of clarity that needs to come from the government. So peaceful deforestation and drainage, just in case you're not very familiar with this. In the natural condition, the water table remains close to the surface. And that's also because of these trees that are having this process of evapotranspiration. So it's sucking up the water and then releasing it into the atmosphere. Right? So you can maintain the water level slightly above sea level below. Right? So these are the peat domes that are very big, vast extents of peatlands. A lot of these peat domes have already been locked or drained. So once you have drainage, the water tables will be lowered. So peat surface subsidence happens, right? And then you have CO2 emissions happening, right? And then with continued drainage, you have decomposition of the peat. And because it is dry, this is like a tinder box, right? So it's basically dry, just waiting for fires to happen, and also drought seasons will just amplify the situation. So at the end of this process, a lot of the peat carbon is released unless you take certain measures to protect it. So the driver of this change for peatlands is really coming from industrial plantations. So as I mentioned, oil palm plantations and also acacia plantations, right? Then more recent studies show how smallholder agriculture is also playing a role. And the degradation of ecosystems then lead to predisposing conditions of these landscapes to fires. So this is a paper from Field et al. So Rockfield, he looks into rainfall patterns and how they influence fires. So he shows a very clear relationship between precipitation per day, right, as well as the active fires that you can detect. So immediately you can see that there's sort of like a hockey stick, whereby below a certain precipitation threshold, below around 4 millimeters per day. So during these times in Sumatra and also in Kalimantan, you see an uptick of fire detections. Right? So droughts play a very big role in leading to big fires occurring. Right? But in general, when you have less rainfall, you have less fires. However, recent studies also show that big fires can happen in non-drought years. So this is in 2030. Right? So this is 2030 data. You probably won't expect that big fire is going to happen, but yet at the same time, there was if you're in Singapore in 2030, there was actually haze coming into Singapore, so problem as well. So like scientists are thinking, is it that is the peatland degradation to a point whereby you no longer need to have severe droughts to lead to big fires anymore? So are we reaching like a tipping point with these ecosystems? So apart from this changing landscape and predisposing conditions for fires, right? You also have the role of social factors in fire emissions. So you can have more immediate drivers causing fires to be light, right? So more than 90% of these fires are human caused, but also a lot of underlying causes of fires. So immediate fires, for example, could be a tool for land clearing, or maybe land tenure disputes or conflict. So people like fires to try to claim land from other people. But the underlying drivers are more related to bigger processes, for example, population growth, what are the prices of commodities during that time, politics as well. So how does your connections from a local level, maybe you want to win an election this year, and you're giving out more land to the local business owners so that they will support you for the political support, right? So how do politics also play a role in interactions with land use, and how that could also influence the use of fires? So, when people ask me why is haze a perennial problem, I often give them 4 main reasons. First and foremost, really, the ecosystem is very depleted. Second, there's a very strong economic incentive to light the fires. And there's also a lot of lack of accountability and lack of placing people to be, or to punish people to account for these fires. So why is that so? What are some of the political structures that are not holding these people accountable? What are some of the economic structures that are not holding these people accountable? And this can happen at a local level and also at maybe more regional level. Unfair land titles and also land tenure makes it very confusing to investigate, like do fire forensics and go down to the ground and find out who's causing the fires. And also enforcement of law. So there are some areas which have been protected under the moratorium, and these are areas where people have not really been monitoring and stopping people from committing these fires. So maybe I'll just go through two projects that we've worked on related to the fire issue. So one is a project done by my final year student. He worked on this ES3 research project. So I just posed him the question, why don't you check out what the land conflicts that are happening in Sumatra and then do a correlation with the fire detections that we have. So he searched through many newspaper articles to pull out a database and create a database of land conflicts in Sumatra. And then we try to bring it down to the regency level. And then we just do a simple correlation. So he looked into land conflict density on the x-axis per 10,000 square kilometers, and then fire hotspots. So there's a correlation, but doesn't mean that it causes the fires. And another paper that we just published this year is to look into combining what Jefferson did with what Jocelyn was working on. So we look into some spatial variables related to the predisposing conditions and also emission sources. And then we look into this topic for Riau, Jambi, and South Sumatra using pixels, so 1 kilometer pixels, to understand more about what are the factors that are most important to account for these fires. But these fires are only for 2015, so we didn't look at other fire events. Right? So we use this boosted regression tree model to look into what are some of the variables that are most influential to account for the fires. So rainfall and slope. So rainfall is not really surprising. Slope is related also to heatlands, right? So if it's very flat, that's also where heatlands are. Population density, roads, and also how many times those places had fires on them. So that's quite an interesting result because it sort of showed how when you have a fire event occurring, it makes it more susceptible to having fires again. Alright, so I'll move into a project that we just got started on. And this project is related to the Haze by trying to address the topic of peatland degradation. So we're interested in the topic of peatland restoration. So Indonesia, because of the 2015 fire, set up an agency to have a very ambitious goal, which is to restore 2 million hectares of peatlands over a period of 5 years. I highly doubt whether they will succeed. But then, it's at least one step, of progress for the Indonesian government to do something about this issue. Right. So what they plan to do is to re-wet the peatlands, restore the hydrology, revegetate by trying to improve the land cover, and then revitalize the livelihood. So trying to encourage people not to plant oil palm, for example, and go into other forms of peatland agriculture. So these are just some of the activities that they're looking into. A lot of canal blocks that are being constructed. And then revegetation, so using different kinds of seedlings to do, for example, agroforestry, or to encourage the farmers to move into a completely different livelihood. Right? However, this is a very challenging topic. I mean, Kriti and I were discussing today how, whether or not communities would want to buy into this program. It's a very contentious issue. Right, so what we're trying to do is to use this socio-ecological system framework that's developed by Eleanor Ostrom. And what she has done is to separate the ecological systems into resource systems and resource units, and then the social system into governance systems and also actors. And then we want to understand more about the interactions between people and also the peatland systems, and how an intervention, which is peatland restoration, is affecting all these processes. So we're looking at this issue. Initially, I wrote a proposal for 3 places, but I think we'll just focus on Jambi. And in Jambi, we have lots of restoration projects going on. For example, damming of canals, where we have revegetation by introducing coffee agroforestry. Right? So we want to understand more about how this intervention is influencing the ecological systems and also how they're affecting the local actors on the ground. Right? So if we use Eleanor Ostrom's socio-ecological system framework, you have roughly an idea about what the tier 1 variables are. There are a lot more details about the tier 2 variables to try to collect data on. So that's something that would guide our data collection. And then to understand more about the feedback loops that are happening also in these interactions. So for example, is the feedback loop one which actually enhances the pre-existing feedback loop. So for example, if you rewet the peatlands and restricts the amount of land available for agricultural production, that could lead to a raise in the prices of the commodities, and then that could actually lead to an increase in agricultural expansion in this area, right? Or is it one which leads an existing feedback loop in the system? So one example would be if you have strict peatland protection laws, that could lead to curtailing of local governance rules of peatlands, and then that could lead to a loss of this institutional structure. Then that could increase peatland exploitation. And then another form of feedback loop would be an addition. So this is where you have intervention setting components which are completely new and surprising. So for example, people do pre-vegetation programs, but then they use the wrong kind of species, and that leads to invasive plant species in these areas. So we intend to use this framework and to do mainly more social science study led by UT to look into this topic. And another topic is to try to understand more about community participation. So what are the ways in which communities are being involved in PRP's program, the Peatland Restoration Agency's program? Is it a two-way process? Is it just one way? Right. So we want to try to collect data about and also to characterize this participation from communities. And then after that, try to model this participation and how that could influence short-term restoration success. Right? Because the project is only 3 years, we are not able to look into issues related to fires and also how the forest has regenerated. At most, we can just provide short-term indicators of success and the number of deaths that have not been destroyed or the seedling survival within 1 year. Right, so in this case, there will be more interviews and also plant ecologists will be on board next week. So you'll join the team and look more into the topic of reforestation and revegetation. Alright, so what can be done? What more should be done? Right, so I'm ending my talk soon. We know that trends in vegetable oil consumption will continue to increase. Right, so this is global demand for vegetable oil projected to 2050, right? So palm oil contributes a lot to vegetable oil consumption. So we know that there won't be a sort of like a global shortage of people not wanting to consume palm oil. So how can we actually sort of limit, or to control local and also international demand for palm oil? How is it affecting like the land use that's occurring in these areas, especially over peatlands? So one way is through market governance mechanisms like certification and supply chains, because we know that supply chains are linking production sources all the way to consumer markets, right? And if we can try to get every actor in that supply chain to subscribe to a set of standards whereby they regulate their own practices and they only say, for example, source from producers that do not use fires. Right? Could we actually try to use this mechanism to reduce unsustainable land use practices in Indonesia? So this is a paper from Kim Paulson, who I work with as well, but on a different topic. She looked into deforestation and also fires and how certified plantations prior to certification had similar levels of deforestation compared to non-certified plantations, but after certification there seems to be an improvement, so there is less deforestation rate compared to non-certified plantations. Same thing for fires as well. So it seems to have an effect after certification of these plantations. And then also, how do government policies influence production practices? Recently, the EU had announced that their EU RED, which is the Renewable Energy Directive, to import biodiesel from Indonesia will be limited because they don't want to cause deforestation in Indonesia. So that has caused an uproar in Malaysia and Indonesia because they see it as green colonialism, right? Why are you stopping us from developing and sending our palm oil to the EU? So how do these actors, right, more at the government level, influence also the production practices in Indonesia? So even Indonesians themselves say that we would risk palm oil exports in our economy if our own production is not sustainable. So we need to do something. I think this kind of pressure on local governments and also companies, it's very important to have that change coming from Indonesian actors. Right, I won't go into all these details. So this is like the standard list again that I would give to people when they ask me what more should and could be done. Really investing in enforcement, holding companies accountable. We have lots of laws, but it's really the poor implementation and enforcement. Making land use data available and having clarity on that. So a lot of times it's very secretive. The companies don't want to release their concession boundaries, but that would really stop us from understanding what's going on the ground. Having the entire supply chain involved, both from the palm oil sector and also the top oil sector. And then lastly, this is really crucial, which is to dismantle economic and political structures that have not held people accountable, either the local companies, the small-scale actors like the farmers or the businessmen, and also the international players. Many of them are based in Singapore. Right. So with that, just like to thank the Singapore Ministry of Education for funding our work, the library, which has been very huge help with acquiring data from Indonesia, and then my co-authors and collaborators from the NTU project, and my local collaborators from University of Jambi and also Bogor Agricultural University. Right, thank you.
Professor, for such a nice talk and sharing with us the different reasons for Haze in Southeast Asia. So now we shall take some questions from the audience. So questions?
Thank you for your talk. And when they call for bans on palm oil use, like the EU is trying to has banned certain products using palm oil, do you think that's a reasonable way to go, or is it not really the way to go?
I think that if you want to, I mean, I understand the motivation, and I think that it's a very clear, trustworthy way. Because why they want to subscribe to certain like sustainable palm oil? Because they don't trust it, right? Yeah, at the same time, if you don't trust this system, you're not going to encourage more players to enter into the certified sustainable standards, right? Or this body, the RSPO. Right now, the import of CSPO, certified sustainable palm oil, is much lower than expected. I think you have like, I don't know how much million tons of CSPO on the market, maybe only 50% is bought. So why is it that the other 50% is not taken up? And if this demand is coming from Western markets like the US, Europe, Australia, then the producer side of it, right, is that we should encourage more taking up of this market. So instead of banning palm oil, I think we will encourage the uptake of certified sustainable palm oil. We certainly don't want to encourage bad players, right? So you can identify those actors in the landscape that are causing deforestation, raising fires, right? I think banning them is a good solution, but then you need to do something about also encouraging the transformation of the industry within these producers. So it's very controversial to ban palm oil, I would say. I think I learned to also shed some light on this because we go on You have anything to say, Anna?
No, I agree with what you were saying. I mean, the other issue is if you ban palm oil, what you were also saying is you just shift that.
Yes,
People need oil, right?
Yeah.
And what's that going to shift to? And is that then going to cause deforestation in the Amazon instead?
So the vegetable oil, you compare the yields, right? Soybean, rapeseed, canola, they perform like a quarter of their efficiency compared to palm oil. So for 1 hectare, you get 3 to 4 tons, whereas for the rest of these oils is about 1 or less than 1. So land use efficiency is actually very high for the oil palm tree. The problem is where it's growing, right? So if it's growing in biodiverse, carbon-rich areas and peatland, then it is a big problem.
How much of this is just down to environmental injustice though? Like the West or the developed world or the global north, however you want to define it, has kind of had generations to develop their oil products, like corn oil, vegetable oils, soy oils, whatever. And now that Indonesia or areas around Indonesia are having this kind of boom in economy, I think it's mostly because of palm oil production. Everyone's got a problem with it. Like, does the West kind of concern, kind of a hero question, but do the Western markets really have any cause for being picky about where the oil is coming from when they've had X amount of years to exploit their natural resources, whereas Indonesia gets using?
I think any environmental issue, you need to have a historical backdrop of colonialism, right? And how resources have been exploited not traditionally, but for a very long time in these areas. How there's really a lot of great inequality when you start off from down, trying to understand more about sustainable practices. So yeah, you can't run away from debates and very contentious kind of arguments about green colonialism. But if we look at like vegetable oil market, right? Actually, there's a lot of very interesting things to understand also about the history of this market and why has it been developed, and why do these crops experience a boom. I think having like an environmental historian perspective to understand these issues is also sheds some interesting light about how things have developed and how they're playing out right now. But yeah, I think that one of the reasons, say for example, the EU initiative, the ban of palm oil is sort of like linked to the support of EU's for its own rapeseed and also canola farmers as well in the industry. So a lot of palm oil from Indonesia actually goes to EU for biofuel purposes. So if we shut off that market, it's going to have a very big impact on Indonesia. So yeah, there are all these other political factors that are at play. Yeah, so very tricky.
It's interesting as well that palm, like if you think about people who's like, I'm going to ban palm oil, but then they'll often use coconut oil, for example, which is a palm that grows in the tropics.
Right.
And yet palm oil has this bad press. It's just everyone is anti-palm oil, but not so much for soy, for example, and not so much for coconut, and yet they have the same issues, right? So there is something interesting about why palm oil, which is associated with orangutans.
Yeah, how much charismatic
Yeah.
is associated with coconut.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The smallholders get their land from the government, right? Most of them get their land from the government. So government knows, right? The Indonesian government knows. So the question is, the Indonesian government should be asking the smallholders, how are you going to clear the land, to plant this palm oil? And then the smallholders, they have no capacity to refine the palm oil, the fruits out there, to sell the fruit bunch to the big players.
Yes,
Some of them are independent palm oil mills, and most of them are run by the big companies.
Yes. But I think when you say smallholders, it's a container concept. There's lots of heterogeneity in a smallholder. You have a poor farmer who can own like 0.5 hectares to 2 hectares. You can have like a rich entrepreneur who stays in Jakarta, doesn't touch the land at all, but hires like people to work on the land. And that person can own like 200 hectares, which is like a small oil palm plantation. So I think, it's like, I wouldn't place so much faith about how much the government actually knows also about its own independent smallholder players. So there's really a very wide range of actors in this smallholder concept, right? So one part of the active research in this field is to understand this heterogeneity reality of the farmers, knowing where they are, so that we can also link them to the big players, right? So really we want to leverage on the big players because they are the ones who trade, they are the ones who own the mills, and then we want to try to get them to change the practices of the small players. So Greenpeace, all these big NGOs, they target the big players so that they can try to change their supply chains all the way down to the small producers. But doing that is very challenging. Right? All these third-party suppliers supplying to the mill, but they don't always supply to the mill directly. They go through an agent, and then the agent might not want to review where he's getting his palm fresh fruit bunches from.
So certification is a problem as well.
Certification is a tool to try to correct that, but then I think that Indonesia also has its own certification, which is called the ISPO, the Indonesian Sustainable Palm Oil. And that certification scheme has been said to be mandatory for all smallholders. Whether that's a reality, how close it is to a reality, we're all trying to see whether what happens. But it's good that at least the government is taking a step and we are claiming ownership and we want to do something about it. Yeah. But it's very challenging on the ground. Yeah. There's also a lot of political corruption related to this issue. Right? If you go down to the ground, you ask too many questions, people will ask you where you're staying.
So we've experienced it in Singapore, and you see on that, so it's dangerous, people get upset. It's way, way, way worse locally. Are the general population kind of accepting the economic benefits of this industry over kind of their concerns for health, or do people agree? Are there local demonstrations, or can you share light on your knowledge of what's going on there?
Yeah, I think maybe you can also comment on that. But just recently I read a report about how the mother was caring for her infant, and she was so pissed off with all these people who are burning land. She was like, please don't do this anymore, they are suffering. When we were in the field, we talked to people, and some people were just quite nonchalant about it. Yeah, this happens every year, what can we do? Sense of helplessness. But sometimes they're maybe complicit in it. They don't really share so much information as well. There was a very good study done by an economist from NTU School of Public Policy. So he looked at census data and stunting caused by disease. So children who grew up during the 97-98 period showed significant stunting compared to children who also grew up during that period but were not exposed to the disease. So there are some provinces which are not exposed to the disease, but this sample is from those provinces. So there is that significant impact on health, and then that can also lead to an impact on productivity. So being an economist, he also calculated how stunting is correlated to income generation, and then how that led to an impact on the economy. So there is a real cost, but it still goes on. And I think it's very much I think push us to show people have been stepping up and saying no to fires. So you see that in you have the climate rally in Singapore, but we also had climate rally in Kalimantan. So we had the youth of Kalimantan stepping up and saying that we don't want to have fires in Haze anymore. So I do think that and also just talking to young people in Miao, when we were there for a field trip, people are